When I first met Rachel, it felt like the universe was finally giving me a shot at something real. I'd been caught in the hamster wheel of life, day in and day out, working as a project manager at an IT firm. My days were filled with endless emails, tedious meetings, and the constant buzz of fluorescent lights in a drab office that smelled of stale coffee and printer ink. I had a decent salary, a modest apartment, and the sort of existence that drifted quietly by, without ever really touching anything or anyone. I wasn't unhappy, exactly, but I wasn't alive either. And then Rachel came into my life like a bolt of lightning, electrifying everything around her. It was at a friend's housewarming party. I remember that night like it was yesterday. The air was thick with the smell of barbecue and beer, a classic rock playlist humming in the background, and laughter floating through the rooms of a house filled with people I barely knew. I almost didn't go. I was never one for these social gatherings, but a buddy of mine insisted, told me I needed to get out more, to meet new people. I showed up reluctantly, intending to make a brief appearance and slip out when no one was looking. But then I saw her. Rachel was standing near the kitchen, surrounded by a small group, effortlessly commanding the room. She had this effortless way of holding people's attention, her dark hair cascading down her back like waves in a storm, her eyes bright and full of mischief. Her laughter was warm and infectious, cutting through the noise, drawing my eyes toward her like a magnet. She was wearing a black dress that clung to her in all the right places, a crimson lipstick that made her lips stand out in the dim light. I was immediately captivated. Our eyes met for a brief second, just long enough for her to flash me a smile that sent a rush of adrenaline through my veins. I wasn't used to this feeling, a mix of excitement and fear that tightened my chest. I wasn't sure if it was the wine or the way she seemed to look right through me, but I knew I had to talk to her. I made my way across the room, weaving through the crowd, trying to act casual. When I reached her, she turned to me with a look that seemed to say, "Finally, there you are." She extended her hand, her grip firm and confident. "I'm Rachel," she said, her voice smooth, with just a hint of playful curiosity. We talked for hours. I told her about my work, the endless cycles of projects, the deadlines that felt like they were always closing in. She listened with an intensity that made me feel like I was the most interesting person in the world. She shared stories about her job in marketing, her dreams of one day running her own agency, and her desire to see the world beyond the confines of our small city. She had an energy that was contagious, an optimism that felt almost reckless, but entirely captivating. I hadn't felt so alive in years. We laughed, we joked, and by the end of the night, we were sitting on a worn-out couch in the corner, completely lost in conversation. When she left, I had her number saved in my phone, my heart racing with the anticipation of seeing her again. Our first date was just a few days later at a cozy little Italian restaurant she picked, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths and candles in old wine bottles. She seemed to know everyone there, the waiter, the owner, even the old man playing the accordion in the corner. She lit up the room. We talked over pasta and wine, sharing dreams and stories, and I felt like I had known her my whole life. By the time dessert came, I was certain that this woman was something special, something I'd been waiting for without even knowing it. Rachel had this way of making the ordinary feel extraordinary, and I found myself drawn to her like a moth to a flame. Within a few months, things got serious. Rachel moved into my apartment, a modest place in the middle of town, nothing fancy, but it had a nice view of the park. At first, everything was perfect. We were the couple everyone envied, the ones who always seemed so in sync. We had our routines, our inside jokes, and our lazy Sunday mornings in bed with coffee and the newspaper. She brought a spark into my life I hadn't realized I was missing. Her laughter filled the rooms that had once felt so empty. I found myself rushing home from work just to see her, to hear her talk about her day. But as time passed, little things began to change. At first, they were small, almost imperceptible shifts in the rhythm of our life. Rachel started staying late at the office more often. She was always on her phone, typing away, a small smile playing on her lips. I'd ask her what she was doing, and she'd say it was just work, some last-minute emails or catching up with a colleague. Her explanations seemed plausible enough, so I didn't think much of it at first. Then it got more noticeable. Her phone was always on silent, always turned face down on the table. She'd slip away, to take calls in another room, and when she came back, there was a lightness in her step, a gleam in her eye that hadn't been there before. I'd ask her about it, and she'd brush me off with a laugh, saying it was just work stress or that I was being paranoid. But something didn't sit right. One night, I noticed a new dress hanging in the closet, sleek, expensive, not the kind of thing she usually bought for herself. I commented on it, joking that she must have found it on sale. She smiled almost too quickly and told me it was a gift from a client, a thank you for closing a big deal. I nodded, pretending to accept the explanation, but a seed of doubt had already been planted in my mind. The late nights became more frequent. The stories got vaguer. There were times when she would come home with a glow on her face, her cheeks flushed, her eyes dancing. She would shrug off my questions with vague answers, her tone light and dismissive. Then there was the night she came home smelling of cologne, something strong and unfamiliar. It clung to her clothes like a bad omen. I asked her about it, and she laughed it off, saying she'd hugged a coworker at a goodbye party. But the way she said it felt rehearsed, like she was reciting lines from a poorly written script. Then came the night everything changed. It was a Friday, and Rachel had told me she'd be out late for a work function. I stayed up, pretending to watch TV, but really, I was listening for the sound of her keys in the door. Midnight passed, then 1, then 2. I was dozing on the couch when I heard the lock turn. She stumbled in, her hair disheveled, her lipstick smeared, her dress wrinkled as if she'd been wearing it for hours. She looked surprised to see me still up, but quickly recovered, flashing me a tired smile. "Rough night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, my face neutral. She laughed, a high, nervous sound that set my teeth on edge. "Yeah, you could say that," she replied, tossing her purse on the table. "Just a lot of networking and schmoozing. You know how it is." But I didn't know. Not anymore. I smiled back at her, but inside my mind was racing. Something wasn't adding up. The way her hands trembled slightly, the way her eyes didn't quite meet mine, it all felt wrong, like a puzzle missing too many pieces. I watched as she disappeared into the bathroom, the door closing behind her with a quiet click. I sat there, staring at that door, feeling the cold tendrils of doubt wrapping around my heart. I knew I needed to pay closer attention, to stop pretending everything was fine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, something big. And so, I made a decision then and there. I was going to find out what was really going on, no matter where it led me. The morning after Rachel came home late, I woke up to the smell of fresh coffee. She was in the kitchen, humming softly, moving with a lightness I hadn't seen in a while. I watched her from the hallway, my eyes tracing her movements as she reached up to grab a mug from the shelf. She seemed different, almost like she had a new energy coursing through her veins. I couldn't quite place it, but something about the way she was carrying herself felt off. "Morning, sleepyhead," she called out, catching me watching her. She smiled, a wide, carefree grin that seemed to stretch a little too far. "I made your favorite, French roast. Thought you could use a good start to the day." I forced a smile and walked over to the kitchen counter, taking the steaming mug from her hands. "Thanks," I muttered, trying to read her face, searching for some kind of clue, but she was all smiles and sunshine. Rachel was never a morning person. Normally, I'd be the one dragging her out of bed, her groggy complaints filling the air, but today she was practically glowing. As I sipped my coffee, I watched her out of the corner of my eye. She seemed almost nervous, like she was trying too hard to seem casual, her laughter a bit too loud, her movements a bit too quick. I knew her well enough to sense when something was off, and this morning, all my instincts were screaming. That day, I decided to leave work early. I told my boss I wasn't feeling well, something about a stomach bug that needed tending. He didn't ask questions. I'd earned enough goodwill over the years for the occasional early departure. As I walked out of the office, a plan started to form in my mind. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly, but I knew I needed to see Rachel's world from a different angle. Maybe it was paranoia, maybe it was nothing, but I had to know. I found myself driving toward her office building. I'd been there a few times before, picking her up after work or dropping off lunch. It was a sleek, modern place downtown with glass walls and a bustling lobby. I parked a block away and waited, my fingers tapping nervously on the steering wheel. I watched the entrance for a while, not really knowing what I expected to see, but unable to leave. After what felt like an eternity, I saw her. Rachel walked out of the building with a group of colleagues, her head tilted back in laughter. She looked happy, carefree even, her hair catching the late afternoon sun. I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for doubting her. Maybe I really was just imagining things. But then, as the group dispersed, she broke off from the others and turned down a side street. Alone. My pulse quickened. I started the car and followed at a distance, trying to keep my head down. She walked briskly, her heels clicking on the pavement, glancing around as if she was looking for someone. I stayed back, my heart thudding in my chest, every nerve on edge. Then, just as she rounded a corner, she stopped. She pulled out her phone and typed something quickly, her eyes darting up and down the street. A moment later, she turned and walked into a small cafe, tucked between a florist and a used bookstore. I parked the car and slipped out quietly, moving quickly toward the cafe. The bell above the door chimed as I entered, and I caught a glimpse of Rachel near the back, sitting at a small table. She had her phone in her hand, tapping away with a focused expression. I ducked behind a shelf of dusty books by the entrance, pretending to browse while keeping her in my peripheral vision. Minutes passed. I felt the seconds stretching, pulling at my patience. I was about to give up, chalk it all up to my overactive imagination, when the door swung open again. A tall man in a sharp suit walked in, pausing to scan the room before his eyes landed on Rachel. A smile spread across his face, and he made his way over to her table. She looked up, her face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. She stood up and hugged him, tight, like they were old friends. Maybe more. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told a story all its own. The man sat down, leaning in close, his hand brushing against her arm as he spoke. She laughed again, that same carefree laugh I'd heard this morning. I strained to catch a snippet of their conversation over the murmur of the cafe, but it was no use. They were too far away, their voices just a low hum in the background. I stood there, unsure of what to do. I couldn't confront her. Not here. Not like this. I needed more information, something concrete, something that would explain what the hell was going on. I watched them for a few more minutes, my heart pounding, my mind racing through all the possibilities. Was he a client? A friend? Or something else entirely? Before I could think of a plan, Rachel suddenly looked over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the cafe like she'd sensed she was being watched. I quickly ducked behind a tall shelf, my heart slamming in my chest, praying she hadn't seen me. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself. When I dared to peek out again, she was back to laughing, leaning forward with that man, her hand touching his ever so slightly across the table. I needed to get out of there, to think. I slipped out of the cafe, the bell above the door jingling softly as I made my exit. I hurried back to my car, my mind spinning with questions and doubts. Who was this guy? Why did she look so happy with him? And why did I feel like I'd just stumbled onto the edge of something I wasn't supposed to see? I drove around for a while, trying to clear my head, to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, to demand answers. But another part of me knew that I needed to play this smart, to gather more information. I didn't want to accuse her of something without proof, didn't want to jump to conclusions. But the seeds of doubt were already there, sprouting like weeds in my mind. That night when Rachel came home, I was sitting at the kitchen table pretending to read the newspaper. She walked in with that same lightness in her step, humming softly to herself. "Hey, babe," she said casually, dropping her bag on the counter. "How was your day?" I looked up, trying to keep my face neutral, my voice steady. "Oh, the usual. Busy." I paused, watching her closely. "How about you? Anything interesting happen?" She hesitated for just a fraction of a second, a brief flicker in her eyes. "Nah, just the same old stuff," she replied, shrugging. "Had a lunch meeting with some clients. Nothing exciting." I nodded slowly, forcing a smile. "Sounds like fun," I said, my voice light, betraying nothing. But inside my mind was racing. She was lying. I could feel it. And I was going to find out why. The following days, I couldn't shake the image of Rachel with that man in the cafe. It haunted me, gnawed at the edges of my mind like a rat chewing through the walls. I needed to know who he was and what he meant to her. I wasn't going to confront her yet. Not until I had more. I needed to be sure. One way or the other. So, I took a few steps deeper into the shadows of her world. I started small. I checked her phone when she wasn't around, glancing at her call logs, but she'd been careful. No strange numbers, no suspicious messages. Just the usual conversations with friends and colleagues, all perfectly innocent on the surface. I was frustrated, but I wasn't going to stop. I began to feel like a detective in my own life, piecing together a puzzle I wasn't even sure existed. That's when I decided to follow her. It wasn't something I felt proud of, but it felt like my only option. On Tuesday morning, Rachel mentioned she had a late meeting and would be home around 9. I nodded, acting nonchalant. But as soon as she left, I grabbed my keys and followed a few minutes behind. I trailed her car at a safe distance, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. She drove across town, and for a moment I thought maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe she really was going to a meeting. But then she took a left turn down a quiet street, away from the office district, away from where any reasonable meeting might be held. I stayed back, keeping my distance. Her car finally pulled into the parking lot of a boutique hotel. My stomach tightened. I pulled over a block away and watched as she parked and got out, glancing around as if checking to see if anyone was watching. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing like a drum. I waited, holding my breath, watching her every move. She walked quickly, her heels clicking on the pavement, her head low, her steps purposeful. She entered the hotel through a side entrance, not the main lobby. She didn't check in. She just walked in like she'd done this 100 times before. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't good. I waited a few minutes, trying to gather my nerve. I couldn't just sit in the car and let my imagination run wild. I had to see for myself. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the hotel, trying to look casual, like I belonged there. I reached the side entrance and slipped inside, scanning the narrow hallway. It was dimly lit, the carpet worn, the walls yellowed from years of cigarette smoke. I could hear the faint hum of a TV from somewhere nearby. I moved quickly but quietly, my footsteps soft on the old carpet. At the end of the hallway, I saw a door slightly ajar, light spilling out into the dim corridor. I edged closer, careful not to make a sound. I heard voices, her voice, unmistakably, and a man's voice, lower, confident. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they'd hear it. I reached the door and paused, listening. I could hear Rachel's laugh, light and easy, The same laugh she used when she was genuinely happy, the same one she used with me in the early days. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. I leaned closer, peeking through the small gap. My blood turned to ice. Rachel was there, standing close to the man from the cafe. He had his hands on her waist, pulling her close, his lips near her ear, whispering something I couldn't hear. She was smiling, her eyes closed, her body leaning into his, as if they were the only two people in the world. Then, without warning, he pulled her into a kiss. A deep, passionate kiss. Her arms went around his neck, pulling him closer, her fingers tangling in his hair. I felt the room spin. I gripped the door frame to steady myself, my breath catching in my throat. This couldn't be happening, but there it was, right in front of me, undeniable, unmistakable, my wife, my Rachel, in the arms of another man. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to burst through the door, to scream, to demand answers, but I forced myself to stay calm, to stay silent. I needed to hear more, to understand the depth of this betrayal. I moved slightly, angling myself to see better, praying they wouldn't notice the door. The man pulled back slightly, brushing a strand of hair from Rachel's face. "You missed me, didn't you?" he murmured, his voice low and smooth. She giggled, a sound I hadn't heard from her in years. "You know I did," she replied, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "I've been thinking about you all week. Michael doesn't have a clue." I felt a surge of anger, my name on her lips in that dismissive, careless tone. My fists clenched, my nails digging into my palms. I wanted to smash through the door, to drag him out by his collar, but I knew that would be playing my hand too soon. I had to be smart. I had to know exactly what I was dealing with. I pulled back, slipping away from the door and moving quietly back down the hall. I had heard enough for now. I needed to think, to plan my next move. I slipped out of the side entrance and headed back to my car, my mind spinning with 1,000 questions, 1,000 scenarios. Who was he? How long had this been going on? Why did she do it? I got into my car and sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my breaths coming in short, sharp bursts. I could feel the anger rising in my chest, threatening to explode. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. I wasn't going to let this destroy me. I wasn't going to let her see me broken. But I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I pulled out my phone and made a call to a private investigator I knew from work, a guy named Paul who owed me a favor. "I need you to find out everything you can about a man," I said, my voice cold and steady. "And I mean everything." As I hung up, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This wasn't just about Rachel anymore. This was about finding out the truth and preparing for whatever came next. I wasn't going to let her play me for a fool any longer. And as I sat there, watching the hotel from a distance, I made a promise to myself. Rachel would remember this day. It would be the beginning of her end. I waited for Paul's call the next morning, feeling like a hunter lying in wait. My thoughts raced through the events of the previous day, every detail playing over and over in my mind. Rachel had crossed a line, and now it was my turn to act. I wanted to confront her, to throw all the anger, betrayal, and hurt in her face, but I knew that was too easy, too predictable. I needed to be patient. I needed more than just a momentary outburst. I needed to set a trap. Rachel was in the shower, her voice humming a cheerful tune. The water splashed against the tiles, and I felt a surge of contempt. How could she sing so casually when she was living a lie? I forced myself to focus. I needed to keep up the appearance of being clueless. I grabbed my phone and checked my messages. Nothing yet from Paul. I glanced at the clock, 8 a.m. I knew he would come through, but the waiting was eating away at me. I decided to stick to my routine. I headed out for a run, my sneakers pounding against the pavement as I pushed myself harder and harder. Sweat dripped down my face, my breath coming in sharp bursts. but I barely felt it. My mind was elsewhere, at that hotel behind that slightly ajar door, watching my wife in the arms of another man. I gritted my teeth and kept running, trying to shake the image from my head. When I returned home, Rachel was in the kitchen, dressed and ready for work, a smile on her lips as she sipped her coffee. She glanced up at me as I walked in, a slight flicker of something in her eyes. Guilt, maybe, or a hint of nervousness. "Hey, you're back early," she said, setting her cup down. "How was the run?" "Good," I replied, forcing a smile. "Cleared my head." I wiped the sweat from my forehead with a towel and moved closer, studying her face, searching for any sign that she might suspect I knew. But she was composed, too composed, like someone hiding behind a mask. "Got any big plans today?" I asked casually. She shook her head, her smile unwavering. "Just the usual, meetings, phone calls. You know how it is." "Yeah, I do," I said, keeping my tone light. "Maybe we could do dinner tonight? You've been working so hard lately. Thought it might be nice to spend some time together." Her eyes flickered, just for a moment before she nodded. "Sure, that sounds great. How about that new Thai place on Maple? I've been hearing good things." "Perfect," I replied, my smile tightening. "I'll make a reservation." I leaned in, brushing a kiss on her cheek, feeling her stiffen just slightly before she relaxed again. It was a small reaction, but I noticed it. She was hiding something. The shower, the humming, the careful choice of words, all signs of a woman trying too hard to act normal. After she left for work, I grabbed my phone and checked for messages again. A new text from Paul. "Meet me at the usual spot. I've got something for you." My heart rate quickened. I grabbed my keys and headed out the door, trying to keep my breathing steady. The usual spot was a small diner on the edge of town. Paul liked it because the coffee was cheap and nobody paid attention to who was talking to who. When I arrived, Paul was already sitting at a corner booth, his laptop open in front of him, a stack of papers on the table. He looked up as I approached, his expression serious. "Michael," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "I've got some information for you." I slid into the booth, my eyes fixed on him. "Tell me everything," I said, my voice steady, but my heart pounding. Paul leaned back and sighed. "All right, here's what I've got. The guy you saw, his name is Derek Thompson. He's a vice president at some financial consulting firm downtown. No criminal record, but he's got a reputation. Known for being, how do I put this? A player. Likes to get involved with married women. Has a few scandals under his belt, but nothing that's stuck. Seems to know how to keep things under wraps." I felt a surge of anger but kept my voice calm. "How long has he been seeing Rachel?" Paul tapped on his laptop, scrolling through his notes. "Best I can tell, a few months. It's hard to pin down exactly, but I've seen them together at that hotel at least 3 times over the past month. I've got photos, timestamps, the whole 9 yards." He pushed a folder across the table. I opened it, my hands steady, though inside I was boiling. There they were, Rachel and Derek, in a series of candid shots outside the hotel, their bodies close, their faces too damn happy. One of them showed them in the cafe, leaning in close, sharing a laugh. Another, a shot from last week, had them in front of a different hotel. It was undeniable. "Son of a bitch," I muttered under my breath, flipping through the pictures. "What else do you have?" Paul took a sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving mine. "I pulled some phone records, too. She's been texting him almost every day, and there are a lot of calls, usually in the afternoons or late at night when she's supposed to be working late. I also tracked his car. He's been in your neighborhood more than a few times. Never parked too close to your house, but close enough. They're careful, but not careful enough." I felt the rage building in my chest, a deep, burning fire, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had what I needed. It was time to set the trap. "Thanks, Paul," I said, closing the folder and sliding it back. "I owe you one." Paul nodded. "Just be careful, Michael. Don't do anything stupid." I nodded, a grim smile on my face. Don't worry, I've got a plan. I spent the rest of the afternoon making arrangements. I reserved a table at the Thai place, called in a few favors, and made sure everything was in place. That evening, I picked up Rachel from work, playing the part of the loving husband. She looked beautiful, wearing a dress I hadn't seen before, her hair styled just so. I complimented her, watched her blush, and felt the sting of betrayal all over again. At the restaurant, I was charming, attentive, pouring her wine, asking about her day. She seemed relaxed, almost relieved, and I could see the tension melting from her shoulders. I kept the conversation light, talking about everything but the elephant in the room. She had no idea what was coming. Halfway through dinner, I excused myself to the restroom. I slipped out the back door, my heart racing, and made a call. "Now," I whispered into the phone. "It's time." I returned to the table, smiling as if nothing was wrong. Rachel looked up at me, her smile bright. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice light. I nodded, taking my seat. "Yeah, everything's perfect," I said, raising my glass. "To us." She clinked her glass against mine, and as she did, I noticed a movement by the entrance. Paul walked in, followed by Derek Thompson. My heart pounded in my chest as they scanned the room, their eyes landing on our table. Rachel's smile faltered, her eyes widening as she recognized him. I leaned back, my smile never wavering, and whispered, "You didn't expect this, did you?" Her face drained of color, and for the first time in weeks, I saw the mask slip. Rachel's face went pale, her hand tightening around the stem of her wine glass as she watched Derek walk toward us, a look of confusion and alarm flashing across her features. Paul, close behind him, wore a neutral expression, as if this were any other day on the job for him. I kept my eyes on Rachel, waiting for her to say something, to explain herself, but she was frozen in her chair, her eyes darting between Derek and me, searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. "Michael, what is this?" she finally stammered, her voice barely a whisper, her hand trembling. "Why is Derek here?" I leaned back in my chair, keeping my face calm and controlled. "Why don't you tell me, Rachel?" I replied, my voice low but firm. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you two have a lot to catch up on." Derek stopped a few feet from our table, his hands in his pockets, his face a mix of arrogance and annoyance. He glanced at Rachel, then at me, clearly sizing up the situation. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone demanding, like he was used to being in control. I gave him a cold smile. "That's a good question, Derek. Why don't you tell us?" I turned to Rachel, raising an eyebrow. "Or maybe you'd prefer to explain it, Rachel. Maybe you could start with why you were at that hotel with him. And don't lie to me. I already know the answer." Rachel's eyes widened, her breath hitching in her throat. "Michael, I can explain," she began, but her voice faltered, breaking under the weight of the truth. She glanced at Derek, desperate for some kind of support, but he remained silent, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowing at me. I kept my gaze fixed on her. "Explain?" I scoffed, the bitterness in my voice unmistakable. "You're going to explain to me why you've been sneaking around with him behind my back? Why you've been lying to my face every day while you've been off screwing this guy?" A few tables around us had gone quiet, the patrons clearly sensing the tension. I could feel their eyes on us, their curiosity and discomfort almost tangible. Rachel's hand shook harder, her face reddening with a mix of shame and anger. "Michael, please," she said, her voice pleading now, tears welling up in her eyes. "Let's not do this here. Can we just talk privately?" I laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound. "Privately? Like you and Derek at the hotel?" I shot back. "I think we're past the point of privacy, Rachel. You made sure of that when you decided to cheat." Derek stepped closer, his expression hardening. "All right, man. That's enough," he said, trying to insert himself into the conversation, his voice firm. "Whatever this is, you don't need to humiliate her like this." I turned my gaze to him, the anger simmering beneath the surface finally boiling over. Humiliate her? I repeated, my voice rising. You're worried about her humiliation? How about the humiliation she's put me through? How about the lies, the deceit? How about the fact that you've been screwing my wife? The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Derek's face twitched, his confident demeanor slipping for just a second before he regained control. Look, Michael, I didn't know she was married at first, all right? He said, his tone defensive, trying to sound reasonable. By the time I found out, it was too late. I'm sorry, but Rachel made her choices. Her choices? I hissed, leaning forward, my fists clenched under the table. You mean the choice to betray me? To lie to me every day while you two carried on your little affair? Rachel's tears were flowing freely now, her hands shaking as she set her glass down. Michael, please, stop. She sobbed, her voice breaking. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I never wanted to hurt you. I shook my head, the anger and pain twisting inside me like a knife. It's too late for that, Rachel. You've already hurt me more than you can imagine. I looked at Derek, who was watching me carefully, his jaw clenched. And you think you can just walk in here and play the innocent party? You're just as guilty as she is. Derek's eyes darkened, and he took a step closer, his shoulders squaring. I'm not looking for a fight, man, he said, his voice low, dangerous. But I'm not going to stand here and let you throw all the blame on me. This is between you and your wife. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor, the anger boiling over. You're damn right it's between us. But you walked into our marriage, and now you're going to deal with the consequences. I turned to Rachel, my voice dropping to a cold whisper. Tell me, Rachel, how long has this been going on? She looked at me, her face crumpling, her hands twisting in her lap. A few months, she whispered, barely audible. It started out as just flirting at work. I didn't mean for it to turn into anything. But then it just happened. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like a blade slicing through. It just happened? I repeated, my voice incredulous. You don't accidentally sleep with someone, Rachel. You chose this. You chose him over me, over us. Her face twisted with regret, tears streaming down her cheeks. I'm so sorry, Michael, she cried, reaching out for my hand. Please, we can work through this. I still love you. I made a mistake. I pulled my hand back, my face hardening. A mistake? I spat. A mistake is forgetting our anniversary or burning dinner. What you did was a betrayal, a choice you made over and over again. I glanced at Derek, who was watching me with a wary expression. And you're just another arrogant bastard who thinks he can take whatever he wants. Derek's eyes flashed, and he took a step forward, his fists clenching. Watch it, Michael, he warned, his voice low. I'm not the enemy here. I felt the adrenaline surge through my veins, my fists itching for a fight. You think you're not the enemy? You've been screwing my wife, I shouted, my voice loud enough to make heads turn. You think you can just walk away from this? Paul, who had been watching from the sidelines, stepped forward, putting a hand on Derek's shoulder. Maybe you should go, Derek, he suggested calmly, his eyes locked on mine. This isn't the time or place. Derek hesitated, his jaw working, but then he nodded slowly, backing down. Yeah, maybe you're right, he muttered. He turned to Rachel, his expression softening. I'll call you later. Rachel's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. Derek! No! She began, but he was already turning away, heading for the door. As he walked out, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I turned back to Rachel, who was staring at me with a mixture of fear and desperation. This isn't over, I said quietly, my voice steady. Not by a long shot. You're going to tell me everything, Rachel. Every detail, every lie. And then we'll see where we stand. Her shoulders sagged, and she nodded, wiping her tears away with the back of her hand. "I'll tell you everything," she whispered, her voice broken. "Just, please don't hate me." I stared at her, feeling the weight of her words, the weight of the betrayal. "We'll see," I muttered, turning away. "We'll see." The drive home was a thick silence, the kind that makes you want to roll down the windows just to breathe. Rachel sat next to me, her face streaked with tears, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I could feel her glancing at me every few seconds, searching for any sign of forgiveness, but I gave her nothing. She didn't deserve that. Not yet. When we got home, I headed straight for the kitchen, not bothering to wait for her. I poured myself a glass of water, my hand shaking just slightly. I needed to focus, to think. Rachel lingered by the door, hesitating like a child caught in a lie, unsure of how much trouble she was really in. I finally looked up, locking eyes with her. "Talk," I said, my voice cold and sharp. "I want to know everything, Rachel. Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out. I mean it." She flinched at the edge in my voice but nodded slowly. She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling like she was bracing herself for impact. "It started at the office," she began, her voice trembling. "Derek came in for some meetings about a potential partnership. He was charming, always knew what to say. At first, it was just small talk, but then it turned into something more. I didn't mean for it to, Michael, I swear. But he was persistent." I bit back the anger clawing its way up my throat. "Persistent? That's your excuse?" I shot back. "You're not a child, Rachel. You could have said no. You could have stopped this any time, but you didn't. Why?" She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her eyes red and swollen. "I don't know," she whispered. I guess I felt flattered. You were always so busy with work, so caught up in everything else. I felt invisible. Derek made me feel wanted again. I felt a sharp sting in my chest, but I kept my face steady. "So you betrayed me because you felt neglected? Because I was working to keep our life together?" I asked, my voice rising. "Is that what this is?" "No, it's not like that," she pleaded, stepping closer. "I've felt lonely, Michael. I've felt like we were drifting apart for a long time. I know it doesn't justify what I did, but it's the truth. I was weak, and I let myself fall into something I shouldn't have." I took a deep breath, trying to keep the anger in check. "So, how long, Rachel?" I asked, my voice now quieter, more controlled. "How long have you been sneaking around behind my back?" She hesitated for a moment, and I saw her glance at the floor, ashamed. "About 6 months," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It started slowly, drinks after work, then dinners. And then it turned into SX, I finished for her, feeling the bile rise in my throat. "How often?" She closed her eyes, fresh tears slipping down her cheeks. "I don't know. Once a week? Sometimes more? Whenever he was in town for business? Or whenever I could get away?" I felt the room spin for a moment. 6 months of lies, of betrayal. The reality of it settled over me like a heavy blanket. And all that time, you came home to me, played the role of the loving wife, laughed at my jokes, made plans for our future. While you were screwing him on the side? She choked on a sob, nodding. "I'm so sorry, Michael. I was stupid, I was selfish, and I made a mistake." I slammed my hand on the counter, making her jump. "Stop calling it a mistake," I snapped. "A mistake is something you do once. What you did was a series of choices. Every time you met him, every time you lied to me, every time you left my bed to be in his. Those were choices, Rachel. Your choices." She broke down completely then, her shoulders shaking with sobs, her hands covering her face. I felt a rush of conflicting emotions, anger, betrayal, sadness, and even a twisted sense of pity. But I pushed it all down. I wasn't going to let her tears soften me. Not now. I turned away from her, needing some space, some air. I walked out of the kitchen and into the living room, trying to calm the storm inside me. Rachel followed me, her voice pleading. "Michael, please. I know I've hurt you, but I want to make it right. I'll do anything. Counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. I don't want to lose you." I spun around, my eyes narrowing. "Make it right?" I echoed, incredulous. "You think we can just slap a Band-Aid on this and pretend it never happened? You destroyed my trust, Rachel. You destroyed us. There's no easy fix for that." She reached for my arm, her fingers brushing against my sleeve. "I know it's going to take time," she said softly. "But I love you, Michael. I made a horrible mistake, but I want to fix this. I want us to be okay again." I pulled away, my jaw tightening. "I don't know if we can ever be okay again," I said bluntly. "But you know what? I'm willing to hear you out. You're going to give me every detail, every text, every call, every meeting. And then, maybe, I'll decide if you're worth it." Rachel nodded, sniffling, her face a mess of tears and regret. "I'll tell you everything," she promised, her voice breaking. "Just, please give me a chance to make things right." I took a step back, crossing my arms over my chest. "Start talking," I said, my tone hard. "From the beginning, and don't leave anything out." Rachel took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice shaky but steady. She recounted every text, every meeting, every secret rendezvous. She told me about how Derek had charmed her, how he'd made her feel alive, how she'd convinced herself that she deserved this escape from the life we'd built together. I listened, my expression blank, but my mind racing. I was cataloging every word, every admission, every detail she gave me. I needed to know the full scope of her betrayal if I was going to decide what to do next. But as I listened, I felt something else. Something colder, more calculating, taking over. I wasn't just going to listen. I was going to use this. Every word she spoke, every confession, would become a weapon in my hands. When she finished, she looked at me, her eyes wide, waiting for some kind of verdict. I nodded slowly, letting the silence hang heavy between us. "Okay," I finally said, my voice low. "Okay, I've heard enough for now. But this isn't over, Rachel. Not by a long shot." She nodded, swallowing hard, her hands trembling. "I understand," she whispered, looking down at the floor. "Good," I replied, turning away. "Because now it's my turn." I walked out of the room, leaving her standing there, her shoulders slumped, her eyes filled with regret. I needed to think, to plan my next move. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about justice, and I wasn't going to stop until I got it. I shut the door to my office with a firm click, sealing myself off from Rachel's muffled sobs that floated from down the hall. I needed to clear my head, to think through what I'd just done and what I still needed to do. This was no longer just about betrayal. This was about self-preservation, about reclaiming what little was left of my dignity and my life. I dialed Paul, pacing the length of the room as I waited for him to answer. "Michael." Paul's voice came through the line, steady and calm. "I've been expecting your call. What's the next step?" "We need more," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "I want everything we can use against her in court, emails, text messages, financials. I want her to have nothing when this is over. I want Derek's dirt too. Dig deeper, find every skeleton in his closet." Paul let out a low whistle. "You got it, Michael. But be careful. This could get messy." "It's already messy," I said sharply. "Just do it." I hung up and felt a strange calm settle over me, like I'd stepped outside my own life and was looking in from the outside. I walked over to the window, staring out at the darkened street, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I wasn't going to let Rachel get away with this. She had destroyed our life together, and now it was time for me to take back what was mine. The next few days I stayed quiet, methodical. I acted like the shell-shocked, betrayed husband, biding my time. Rachel tried everything to get me to talk, to get me to forgive her, but I kept my distance, gave her nothing but silence. She was desperate, her eyes constantly searching my face for a sign of softness, a crack in my armor. But I wasn't going to crack. Not now. Paul sent me updates regularly, and what he found was gold. Derek's financials were a mess. He was swimming in debt, and there were rumors of an affair with another woman, someone from his firm. Rachel wasn't the only one he was playing, and I knew that could work in my favor. It painted a picture of him as a serial manipulator, someone who preyed on vulnerable women. I could use that in court, make sure Rachel got nothing but regret from this mess. Finally, I decided it was time to confront Derek. I wasn't going to let him slip away quietly while Rachel and I were left to deal with the fallout. I arranged a meeting through Paul, making sure Derek would be alone at his office. When I arrived, the building was quiet, the overhead lights buzzing faintly. I made my way down the hall and pushed open his office door without knocking. Derek looked up, surprised, but quickly recovered, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Michael," he greeted, leaning back in his chair with forced casualness. "What brings you here?" I closed the door behind me, stepping forward with deliberate slowness. "I think you know why I'm here," I said evenly. "We need to have a conversation about what happens next." He chuckled, folding his hands across his chest. "I'm not sure what there is to talk about," he replied coolly. "Rachel made her choices, and you can't pin that on me." "I'm not here to play the blame game, Derek," I countered, keeping my voice steady. "I'm here to make sure you understand what happens if you don't back off. You walk away from Rachel, today, and I won't bury you with what I've got." Derek's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. "And what exactly do you think you've got on me?" he challenged. "Plenty," I replied with a cold smile. "Financial troubles, insider trading rumors, a second affair at your firm. I'll make sure your name is mud by the time I'm done with you. Or, you can just walk away now and I'll let this slide. Your call." He hesitated, his confidence wavering. "Fine," he finally muttered. "I'm done. She's all yours. I've got bigger problems to deal with." I nodded, satisfied. "Good. Remember, one wrong move and I'll bury you." I turned and left his office, a grim satisfaction settling over me. Step one was complete. Now it was time to deal with Rachel. When I got home, I found her waiting in the living room, her eyes puffy, her face pale with worry. "Did you talk to him?" she asked, her voice small and fragile. I nodded, crossing my arms. "He's out of your life for good. Now, we need to talk about what happens next." Her face softened with relief, and for a brief second, I thought I saw hope flicker in her eyes. "Michael, thank you. I know I don't deserve it, but thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," I replied, my voice cold. "This isn't about doing you a favor. I've decided that we're done, Rachel. I've already contacted a lawyer. I want a divorce." Her face fell, and she reached out, trying to touch my arm, but I stepped back. "No, Michael, please. We can fix this," she pleaded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'll do anything. I'll make it right. Just don't leave me." I shook my head, my voice steady, my resolve firm. "It's too late for that, Rachel. You made your choices, and now I'm making mine. I deserve better than this." She fell to her knees, sobbing. "Please, Michael, I love you. I'm so sorry. I was stupid, but please don't do this." I took a deep breath, fighting the mixture of anger and pity. "Love isn't always enough," I said quietly. "Goodbye, Rachel." I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I heard a sudden, sharp gasp from behind me. I whipped around to see Rachel clutching her chest, her face contorted in pain. Her eyes widened in panic, and she collapsed onto the floor, her breathing ragged and shallow. "Rachel!" I shouted, rushing over, my heart pounding in my chest. I knelt beside her, my hands trembling as I reached for my phone, dialing 911. "Rachel, stay with me," I pleaded, my voice breaking. "Come on, stay with me." She was struggling to breathe, her face pale, her body trembling. I could see the terror in her eyes, the realization that something was very, very wrong. "Michael, I'm sorry," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't talk," I insisted, panic clawing at my throat. "Just hold on, okay? Help is on the way." The minutes dragged by like hours as I held her hand, feeling the weak, erratic pulse beneath my fingers. The paramedics arrived, bursting through the door, and I moved aside as they rushed to her, their voices urgent and calm. I watched helplessly as they worked, as they tried to stabilize her, their faces grim. I felt a strange detachment, a numbness settling over me. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Not like this. I wanted justice, retribution, but not this. After what felt like an eternity, they loaded her onto a stretcher and rushed her to the ambulance. I followed, my mind spinning, my heart heavy. At the hospital, I sat in the waiting room, staring at the cold, sterile walls, my hands shaking. Hours passed, but I felt every second ticking by, each one a small eternity. Finally, a doctor approached me, his face serious. "Mr. Michael?" he asked, his tone somber. I stood up, my legs unsteady. Is she going to be okay?" He sighed, his expression grave. "She had a heart attack, a severe one. We've stabilized her for now, but she's not out of the woods. The next 24 hours are critical." I nodded numbly, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy blanket. "Can I see her?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He hesitated, then nodded. "Just for a moment. She's still very weak." I followed him to her room, my heart in my throat. She lay there, pale and fragile, tubes and wires everywhere. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. I sat beside her, taking her hand in mine, feeling the coldness of her skin. "I'm sorry, Rachel," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "I'm so sorry." Her eyes fluttered open, just for a moment, and she looked at me with a weak, sad smile. "I'm sorry too," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. I squeezed her hand, feeling the tears spill down my cheeks. "Just hold on," I murmured. "Please, hold on." The machines beeped softly in the background, and I sat there, holding her hand, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I had wanted justice, but not like this. I had wanted revenge, but now all I felt was an overwhelming sense of loss. As I sat there, I realized that no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same.